Thank you, Kira. So a couple of things. We have quite a few incredible women that are in elected office. The new Pride agenda wants to make it very clear that they are not endorsing any particular candidate. I just want to say that this is for a conversation so that we could enjoy that. The other part too is that when we talk about women in politics, this is about all the identities women bring to the table. This is what's so important about this conversation, that we're going to get to talk about that and hear from different perspectives and views. So I wanted to actually start with Kira to just lay kind of the groundwork for us. Give us kind of the national, kind of the data landscape a bit as we set the stage for the conversation.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time for women in politics. The 2018 election, I'm sure everyone was following, and we saw incredible numbers of women running, including women on this panel. And what we're seeing this year, of course, with Kamala Harris as vice president, this is quite a moment for the country and for women and women of color especially. Surprisingly, I think women haven't done as well in the United States as you might think. And if you look at us in comparative perspective, we're not at the top of any lists about women's representation. Now, that being said, we did come through these really historic elections, 2018 and then 2020. Our numbers so far, there's still some uncalled races, but women's representation is going up nationally. So women will be at least 26% of members of Congress. That's very far from parity. You don't have to be a math major to know that we're not at parity there. That is a historic number. Women of color have made incredible gains. There'll be a record number of women of color serving in Congress this time. At the local level, I think there's often assumptions that women are doing really well at the local level. They're just not reaching the highest offices, but actually people on this panel can speak to this, that's not the case. And so women's representation oftentimes is actually lower at the local level than it is at the state legislative level. And so you just don't see as many women mayors as you might think. And I think that we can get into some of the challenges, but there are certainly challenges out there that I'm sure we're going to discuss. So I think there are a lot of firsts yet to be achieved. So why don't we stop there for now?
Great. Well, thank you for that. I want to say too that what's exciting about this is this isn't about just talking about women in politics, which we are, but having New Pride Agenda host this conversation is what are the impacts when we think about LGBTQIA? What are we seeing there through that lens? How is that going to impact kind of political visibility? And so I actually wanted to turn to Crystal first. And as someone who's actually working in the city council, but someone who's going to run, who's running actively, talk a little bit about that landscape. What made you decide to do that? What are you confronting? What are you seeing as challenges, but also opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I decided to run actually because my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease about 7 years ago. I'm the only child of a single mother, and just the experience I've had trying to get access to resources and services for my mother, who spent over 30 years as a nurse, and then when it was time for her to receive care, essentially had none available to her. That's what got me actually into public service. And I've been in public service for the last couple of years, and it was through my work in public service that I was encouraged to run by constituents, by neighbors. And so that's sort of how I got here. If I'm elected, I would be the first gay Black woman elected to the city council, which seems like it shouldn't be a first in 2020. But I think, the truth is there's no real support. There's no infrastructure. Black women are the last on everybody's list. First to sort of fix things when we need things fixed, but most certainly overlooked. And so when it comes to fundraising support, institutional support, there just really isn't any. Thankfully, New York City has a great matching program, which helps to level the playing field. But I think it's really important that we, are very deliberate about who we are electing, and the types of people that we want to see a full representative government, and at all levels really. But I think to Kira's point, local government is really what has the greatest impact on our day-to-day lives. And so if we're not seeing ourselves in that space, then it is harder to think about seeing ourselves at any other level. And so, you know, I think if we can find ways to really create some sort of structural support, long-lasting support, organizations that, you know, seek people who look like me out, then, you know, that's certainly a first step.
Yeah. When we think about that, and I love that piece around local being almost the most personal, the most intimate part of democracy, right? And us not having necessarily as much visibility. So thank you for being someone who's there, who's pushing to do that. I wanted to talk to Melissa and ask the question, because here you have Crystal, energy, youthful, right? Coming on the stage right now, right? You see what pushed her into thinking about political office was obviously something that happened in her family, which for many of us quite often triggers to go into politics or to serve is a personal connection to a situation. Melissa, can you talk to me a little bit about when we're thinking about women in politics, particularly queer women in politics, what are some of the unique challenges we're talking about from your perspective? What have you seen over time that shifted? And how do you look at it personally for yourself as a trans woman, as a Democratic leader?
Thanks, Lisette. Thanks for asking the question. You know, we're not gonna talk about federal here. That's silly. We're not even gonna talk about state. Let's just talk about the city. But I can tell you this, that we're in a revolution right now in representative politics, and we have one person to thank, and that is Donald Trump. And when there was one human being in America who thought Donald Trump was going to be the president, that was Steve Bannon. No one else thought that was going to happen, that it was possible for him to win. And people across the country saw this, and women across the country saw this, that this terrifying, toxic president was going to be in charge of everything. And so women that were involved in politics, women that weren't involved in politics, women that marginally cared, all of a sudden became involved, became active, became concerned, became engaged and ready. Donald Trump is what brought me the idea that someone who is so different from the neighborhood, and you know, the Republican, well, the one party talks about identity politics and they mock about it. What identity politics is what happens when non-white men, non-white and non-men run for office. They call it identity politics. It is extremely empowering. It's important to have a representative government that looks like the neighborhood. I've been involved in politics. I was going to run in district leader in, oh my God, 2002, and I was afraid. I didn't want my gender identity to be out there. The idea that it would be public never occurred to me. My mentors were Tom Duane and Christine Quinn at the time. I lived in Manhattan. Now, after Donald Trump is elected, we can all turn around and realize there's no one coming to help us. The cavalry is not coming. We are the cavalry. And so whether we are a history of being undocumented or a child of a single parent with Alzheimer's, now is the time to roll up your sleeves and to do something that you've thought about and talked about and all this, and now is the time for action. That led to an explosion in Congress in 2018 and across the board, where we have Assemblymember Catalina Cruz representing, involved in a whole new cohort of women. I think women, in fact, women were so successful in 2018, even the Republicans have nominated women, and we saw a huge increase in women going on the Republican side. 35 women were elected this past election to go as Republicans, and not because they are more caring and feeling, they're more conservative than the men. Some of them are truly scary. What's happening is, compared to Donald Trump, people want candidates they can trust. And that's where women are always going to be on top when it comes to on that trust scale. You can get people that are smart, have profound experience. When it comes to trust, people trust women. The Democratic side showed that in 2018, and now the Republicans were so inspired that they're doing it in 2020. I ran for assembly in a district that was 99.8% non-transgender. And so what I learned to do in years of politics is talk about the issues, not about me, but talk about the issues that affect the families in New York. They don't really care about me. They want to know what I'm going to do to make their lives better, more stable, food on the table, roof over the head, transportation, school, all the basic issues for me to be able to engage. Unfortunately, I live in a district that voted, the southern half voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. I thought I had the political skill to win them over. Sadly, I was mistaken. I did well, but not well enough to win. I think that this cohort of queer women led by people like Crystal Hudson is going to show New York that this is a new era in politics, that there are going to be women, there are going to be queer women, there are going to be trans women, they're all going to be on the ballot. And hopefully this year, not only will we see our first Black gay woman, but perhaps our first trans woman also in the city council, which will be very exciting for New York.
Yeah, that would be exciting to see. And I'm actually gonna go to Catalina Cruz, and so you were part of the wave, right? So you were part of a whole new group of women who were elected, right? Talk a little bit about what is the unique role that you feel you're representing and highlighting, a viewpoint that you bring that's unique to you, right? And also, and if you could talk a little bit also about, you mentioned it in your opening, but it's something that Crystal said too when the panelists were speaking before we went live, fundraising. Talking a little bit about that, right?
Yeah, my favorite topic. So Lisette, look, I think when you run for office, your uniqueness and what makes you that good candidate for your district has a lot to do with what your district is all about, who lives there, the kind of people that you're representing. And yes, but for me individually, the life that I've lived up until now is very representative of the community that I now get to fight for. You know, I grew up as a dreamer and documented from 1992 plus 13, 14 years after. I had the luck of becoming a permanent resident, citizen, a lawyer, a child of public school. My mom is a nurse by trade. She was a nurse in Colombia when we moved here. Like many immigrant families, she worked as a domestic worker. She sold food in the street. She gave out flyers and right here in my neighborhood, right a few blocks from where I'm at now. And so that is very emblematic of what my district is, what my community is, and has been for a very long time. We are the most diverse district in the entire country. 60% of the people that I represent were born in another country. 40% cannot even vote for me because they're only permanent residents, have DACA, are completely undocumented. And so the lives of the little girls in our schools and the moms and the parents, it literally who I am and who my family has been. And so I think when you're going to lead a community, when you want to put everything on the line, because that's the part that they don't tell you, when you're running for office, you're putting your health, your credit, your emotional well-being on the line. When you want to do all of that, it's because you think you have something unique and really good to offer to the fight. And for a very long time, my community was represented not just by my predecessor, but the person before that person, that were much more interested in political power versus actually doing work. I brought to the table 10 years as a litigator and a government attorney, having actually drafted laws, implemented them, and understood how they actually impacted people. And for me, this was truly about the love of the community, because I could much more easily have gone back to litigation and have a less complicated life. But to me, this was the only thing I could think about doing after 2016, because I felt incredibly privileged because I had to recognize that I am a white passing Latina, that I'm educated, and that I've gained all these things. And what was I gonna do with it? Just go earn a bunch of money? Sounds great, but if I could use all those skills to improve the lives of people that were still struggling with what my family struggled with for years, then why not? I owed it. I honestly felt like I owed it to this country, a country that has given me so much. And so when I ran, it was very difficult. And since you ask about fundraising, I was outraised 2-1. And the first fundraiser was a bunch of my amazing friends that I worked with when I was at the city council and their significant others, Crystal, and just a bunch of amazing people in someone's living room, raising a 25, 30, $50 from folks just to kind of get my feet wet, if you will, and started down that path. And we raised, I want to say, about $250,000 to run a race where I don't like to say opponent, I like to say the other candidate, where the other candidate completely outraised me but never outworked me. And so, one of the things that I always tell people who are running for office is the time and place in politics where money was everything and it was determinative of who won, that time is gone. That doesn't mean you don't still need the money. You need to raise the money. You need to do the call time. You need to make, what do they tell you? The inner circle and the outer circle of people who are going to give you money. You need to do all of that. But if you come close and you have community support and you're running, and I always say this, and you're running for the right reasons, not for your ego, not for your career, not for your resume, but because the people in your community really truly could benefit from what you have to offer, then money isn't everything. Get a ton of volunteers, get a lot of community support, and people will show up. We ended up winning by 11% of the vote over the other candidate.
There you go, right? As I said, out fundraised, but not outworked, right? There you go. That's a key piece. And as we think about that, particularly the inspiration of what it means in your opening, Camille, you talked about that movements, right? Right, that this goes hand in hand, right? Like and so when I think about you and your story, how you opened, you talked about being a mom, right? And why you decided to go into this. Tell me a little bit about what led you to 21 and 21 and what it is, so that folks who are listening could hear the good work that you're doing.
Yes, and I'm a board member for 2121. I'm the secretary. The organization was founded by a number of women who basically realized that they were, well, not realized, but walked into the council and said, there's only like 6 of us. And it was literally so different before. And so Melissa Margarito, Elizabeth Crowley, and a number of elected officials created a space and hired an executive director. And the ultimate goal was to elect 21 women from all across the city, utilizing, and we changed the theory, utilizing ranked choice voting. Our board is it's a very interesting board, because I would say I'm the most left progressive one in the space. But we all have one thing in common, and that one thing in common is understanding that the representation of women in any space of identity, of how you identify yourself as a woman, is lacking within city government, in particular within the city council. It is devastating. And I just got very tired of talking to county leaders and screaming and yelling, and then, talking my ear and saying, oh, but we have a judge that we elected, or we have this, or we, Carl knows my rant on this. I'm not at all scared to say that we have allowed leaders to define who and should be in office. And I think all of us in 21 and 21 started a process many years ago, and then the last year, to say, okay, how do we do this in a way that, because we don't, and I think even in spaces of color, we do this, right? We want to do it the way, most white privileged spaces do. We just come in, we get the power, and then we deal with the power, right? And then we own it. But it doesn't work that way. When we think about, marginalized communities of color and women, we don't think that way. And so the ranked choice voting allowed us to think differently about, okay, we want to elect all these women. Some of them will be to the left, some of them will be to the middle, some of them won't be on the same page, but we're going to make sure that even if we rank them, we're going to have a shot no matter what to get these women in office, because that is the ultimate goal. Because as you know, women in politics, you've seen the Prime Minister of New Zealand, you see all these women, we are the only country that hasn't had a woman president. The only country, right? Maybe a couple of other smaller ones, but like, you know, other countries that were defined to be third, what they called in the, you know, third world or not, you know, poor countries. We have not had a woman be president of the United States. So our board is very much in tune to doing that. So what we started with was basically creating a membership, moving conversations about how to build your public narrative, moving how you raise money. Catalina talked about the circles. We teach around the circles. We talk about the story. So Crystal Hudson's story is real, and she knows, Crystal knows that I have a grandmother who just recently died of Alzheimer's. It's a devastating disease, and it's part of her narrative of why she's wants to make a difference, right, in the city, and that's why she's running. We have to allow women to tell that story, so we're teaching them to tell that story. And we're also pushing back. I mean, I think people saw some of the Twitter drama around why didn't we choose, you know, one candidate, and why did we do X, Y, Z? Well, because we're going to do things differently, because ranked choice voting has allowed us the opportunity to raise all of you up, right, at the same time. So even if you're choice 1 versus choice 3, we're still going to help you. We're still going to make sure that when you're talking about each other, we're going to be lifting you up. And so that, I mean, that's the ultimate goal. We have a lot of work to do. We want to raise as much money as possible for our organization so that we can give it to the candidates and support their work on the ground. All of the women on our board are fierce, and really just care so much about the women, all of the women that are running. And, you know, just very, very proud to continue to work with folks. And I could, you know, I'm an ally here, but I can listen to Melissa and Crystal all day long. I don't even need to speak. So it's great.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that, Camille. I know that we have a couple of people from the audience that are already asking questions. And I guess I wanted to ask this question, and whoever responds to it, please jump in, and then we'll go to some other questions from the audience. Is that this idea of really outdated socialized gender roles and norms, right? And how does that play a role when we think about women in politics and organizing? And I would say, how is that also layered? I mean, from my perspective, most of my research is on workforce as well. And what I see is just how that's just become even more oppressive during the pandemic, right? We're looking at women, how they're impacted economically, the outdated social norms, gender norms, the challenges that they're managing. So talk to me about when you're looking at women in politics or going for elected office, how have you confronted this or managed this?
So after World War II, here in New York City, in an effort to liberalize and create opportunities in the county parties, they created male leaders and female leaders. And the idea was to get women involved in politics, and it worked. If we could take a look at generations of great women leaders in politics, whether it's Geraldine Ferraro and Helen Marshall here in Queens, and Nydia Velasquez. So this concept has worked to a point. You know, now it is obsolete, and the future is going to eliminate these gender identity roles when it comes to political leaders. Now we've seen New York State is doing away with the male and female designations, and that's going to spread. With the non-binary movement that's starting in the queer community is going to branch out and going to create, and ranked choice will also create a new generation of leaders regardless of gender. And again, because I think New York, remember, I don't want to disagree with Camille, we did elect a woman to be our president in 2016 by 3 million votes. But sadly, that didn't take place in terms of her actually becoming president. So we'll just have to wait a little bit longer, perhaps, for Kamala to step up. So I think that New York is ready to move beyond outdated gender roles when it comes to real smart political leadership. And we're seeing that now with people like Crystal and Catalina.
Right.
And Lisette, if I may add a little bit to that, I think one of the key things in kind of destroying this boys club, you know, and kind of gaining entrance is having more folks like Camille. I mean, Camille's one of the first Latinas to actually get into this business. There's like, you can count them in one hand, the number of Latinas who are actually doing this kind of work of helping people like Crystal and Melissa and I actually get into elected office. And often we talk about how important it is to have representation on this side of the business, if you will. But we're very seldom do we have the conversation of how important it is to have that support system that highlights your story, that talks about, you know, who you are, and that understands your level of crazy, because nobody's going to understand that like someone who's gone through the ringer in, you know, just like you have. And I'd love to see more LGBTQI led firms as well that are going to be doing this kind of work, so that we can elevate that platform.
Yeah, and Kira, from your perspective, what are we seeing nationally along these lines? I mean, I know we're talking about New York, but what are we seeing nationally as well in this?
Well, I just want to point out that you do hear about an old boys network all over the place, and not just in New York. And I think that is real in a lot of places. And I think, unfortunately, if women don't seize the power that they have, they won't have it. And so I think it's just wonderful that these organizations are stepping up here in New York City. I think nationally, one thing to also keep in mind, though, is the pushback that women are getting from the president and his supporters. So it's not, you know, women define themselves as candidates, and they can pursue their agendas and speak with passion about the issues that they care about. But I think the Assemblywoman said, the opponent or the other candidate, I can't remember how you wanted to refer to your opponent, but there is always some opponent trying to define you. And so I think that that is, you know, that can be really challenging. And we've come through this period of, on the one hand, women in the Democratic Party are soaring. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, woman vice president. Woman president we could have had in 2016, women will be about, I think, 40% of members of the US House in the Democratic Party in terms of the Democrats, not so on the Republican side. So I think that basically there's a lot of misogyny that we're seeing that's kind of accepted, that Trump has made acceptable. And so I think it's led to the resistance and has led to women running, but it has really created a toxic environment, unfortunately. So although in 2020, we would think that we would be beyond a lot of these outdated ideas, you know, those ideas unfortunately are alive and well on the right.
Absolutely, absolutely. Boy, we can go down that road for a long way, but I'm curious, Crystal, from your perspective, as someone who is inspired to run, heard your narrative of why you were inspired to run. Someone asked the question, what is an action they can do to promote supporting women in politics, right? So you're the closest in it right now, right? And starting, what are the actions that have happened to you at the most local, kind of intimate, personal level that supported you running, and that other people who are listening to you tonight can, you know, replicate?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, one of the statistics you hear all the time is that it takes a woman has to be asked 7 times to run for office before she says yes. And a man, it doesn't even need to be asked, right? They're just doing it. It took me way more than 7 times before I said yes. And that's because, generally speaking, we do have so many more things, many more factors to take into consideration. You know, my partner and I live at home with my mother and we care for her. And so, you know, running for office usually means you have to leave your job eventually. You know, and when I talked earlier about like real infrastructure and support, that's the type of stuff I'm talking about. You know, you shouldn't have to leave your job or leave a job in order to run for office full time, you know, in order to run a winning campaign, which then means we either need to introduce some new laws that allow people to use campaign financing to pay regular expenses like rent and healthcare bills and things like that. Or we need to shorten the campaigning periods, and which is the case in so many other countries. People don't run as long as we run here in the States for a particular office. But we need to find ways to actually support women. In terms of what individuals can do, I think, we talked about the money piece. That's always, very helpful and one easy way. But like asking people, how you might be able to support them in other ways. Maybe, I had somebody offer to pay like my cell phone bill, for example. They were like, I don't know if I could do a whole lot, but if you ever need like just a bill to be paid on a monthly basis, I'm happy to do that for you. And I haven't taken them up on it yet, but there may come a time when I need to. Just thinking about other things like that, even in terms of like time, resources, volunteering on campaigns, supporting candidates, non-traditional candidates. Hopefully we will become traditional candidates very soon. But supporting folks in many different ways and providing help and assistance, whatever way that you are able to do.
Absolutely. And also, as Camille also said before too, 21 and 21, thinking about this kind of cross section of women that came together to really say, how do we support women, right? In a way where it's not you over you. How can we collectively, lift all boats, right? And so that's another way of supporting that. I'd love to, there's someone put something on the chat and I thought it was interesting because one thing that we know is this question of equal pay, right? Women's pay, right? The value of women economically, right? And so someone brought up the issue of equal pay versus equity. How do you represent or understand that as a challenge politically and pushing for equity pay? Is that part of your agenda? Do you talk about it? Camille, I'd love to start with you as an organizer, as a single mom that started out.
Yeah, I have a lot of feelings about equal pay as a woman of color, because not only are, white men paid more, white women are paid more, Black men are paid more, and then there's us. And I went into an organizing, world thinking that my pay was normal, not understanding and not even knowing how to negotiate. And even now as a consultant, thinking about how I value my work and not necessarily, and I'm not trying to Rebecca and I say this all the time, we're not trying to make a killing, we're trying to make a living based on our movement space and where we end. And I think we have to really address the issue. And I really want, I really want folks to actually, if folks can and have time to read in this pandemic, to read Isabel Wilkinson's Caste. It is an amazing book that talks about the upper and lower caste situations, and it is phenomenal. I wouldn't say it's her Warmth of All Suns, because that book is just amazing, but it really talks about the upper and what we would call the lower caste, which is people of color. And money is a real driver in that. And I don't know, I think we have to really figure out before we go to what's the equity pay? Well, not for nothing, you still haven't paid what you need to pay for women of color. Let's start there and start with, how you actually, women, LGBTQ, trans, all those are spaces that you have not even elevated. So how can we even talk about equity when you haven't lifted all those spaces up? And so I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that we as women have to push harder. The negotiations around even salaries is so intimidating still. And even as strong of a big mouth that I have, right, I still sometimes find myself in a space where I'm like, should I be asking this? I'm in a movement space. Should I be, saying to myself, well, you know what, my voice is worth that. And I think all of us in this space have to say, no, actually, my voice is worth that. And I am going to have a hard conversation with you about how you have to pay what I am worth, because it's deeper than what it actually means for someone, for a white male,
Absolutely, absolutely. And we will certainly be hearing more of this. Catalina, have you seen any kind of work happening in your area talking about this?
Look, you know, all the legislative proposals, but that's more on the political end. I think one of the things that many of us who either run or have held office try to do, those of us who actually really believe in this idea of equality, is try to make sure, even when we have a small budget, that we are paying folks what they deserve, and that we're paying women based on their experience, and sometimes a little bit extra just to make sure that they're doing well. Because I think, you know, people like Crystal and I weren't meant to run. People like Melissa weren't expected to want to do this job. And so if we're not giving each other a hand in making sure that those who are helping up are getting paid a livable wage, are getting access to opportunities and referrals, because those are big for folks who may not, maybe I can't give you the job, but I'll refer you to someone who can and is going to pay you well. And I think it also starts, yes, we got to push the legislation. We got to make sure that we're creating situations, laws that create situations where we're getting paid the same, and frankly, sometimes we're more experienced, so getting paid more. But we also have to lead by practice and making sure that if you, because I've seen this happen, if you had a male campaign manager and you let him go, you can then hire maybe perhaps a woman campaign manager and pay her lower than you were paying him. You have to make sure that you're paying them at least the same, maybe even more. And so for me, a lot of it is we have to lead by example.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that too, right? So one is like when Camille, you're talking about it, how do I understand it on a personal level, and in a place where we're about values forward, right? We talk about service, public service, being called to service. And so then feeling that tension, this binary, well, if you're there for service, you can't be negotiating your worth in this way, right? So it's interesting. And Catalina, I really appreciated your point, which is really pushing on the issue of positional power. Know when you have power and how are you representing it, right? Because that's another piece. Well, I know that there's this question here, and I know a few of us can jump in.
I may add something before I forget.
Sure, please do.
All of us here, you know, sometimes we may think that you don't have the power to change perhaps all of the law, or you may not have enough money because you're running a grassroots campaign. But when you open the door to someone who's never been in that political public sphere, you're creating an opportunity for that young woman, that young LGBTI member of our community to have exposure to something that we never did. And I think that's part of the conversation that also needs to happen, because if we really want to have leaders 5-10 years from now, we need to think about who we're bringing into our circles as mentees, as interns, making sure that we are creating those opportunities. It's our responsibility to make sure that we create them.
Absolutely, that you're not the last, as we say, right? And so there's a question on here, and I'm actually going to ask Kira to start from just the national perspective from Sklarz. Oh boy, if I read it one more time in the paper, it's going to get to me again. But why the majority of women supported Trump?
Yeah, I think that's
And
the
then
majority
others
of white.
chime in on that as well. Okay.
I think that's probably was meant to say white women, because most women supported Biden. And that's been a gender gap that we've seen in the presidential election since 1980. You may know women have been more democratic at the presidential level and for other races as well. I think that white women have been voting for Republican presidential candidates for quite some time, so it's not really that surprising. I think what gets overlooked sometimes when we talk about the gender gap is the groups of women who are very democratic. So we often forget, as I think Crystal was mentioning earlier, Black women, we want Black women's votes, but we might not want them to be the nominee for Senate or something like that. So Black women are heavily, heavily democratic, and they helped Biden win, and we saw that in Georgia with Stacey Abrams' mobilization on his behalf. And I think with Trump, you see an economic message, but you also see a message about white supremacy. And I think that we need to take seriously some of the different positions that women have based on race and class, basically. And so there's not all one voice there in terms of the women's vote.
Absolutely. And Camille, I know you are waiting to jump in on this
Oh,
one.
I'm so waiting on this.
Go for it. Go for it.
And so I think there's two things here to add to this point. Again, the unconscious bias of white women in a lot of these spaces is real, even in the progressive movement, right? Again, pointing to Cass and even pointing to some stories that I've just recently been in. SNL did a skit about the Black Lives Matter movement and how most white women went over and like got out of their heated seats and was all about it, right? But when they went into the voting booth, right, they protected their caste, they protected their space. And we have a lot to work to do to become more radically empathetic about race in America. And we're going to continue to have a lot of these unconscious style conversations, and particularly with white women who, unfortunately, in some of these spaces, create a sense of security based on security itself, right? Well, I need my house to be safe. I love Black women. I love LGBTQ. I love you all. Let's go have martinis. But when it comes to like have a space of power, right? That's where it's like, well, and you see those microaggressions. You see it on a phone call when, I was on a call with the DSCC and I was like, I had white consultants telling me how I should speak in Spanish to my community. Well, the numbers say this, and I'm like, don't tell me how my mother speaks to me when she wakes me up in the morning. That's the script I'm writing, and that's who I know is going to move people. The same thing goes on a call, right? When I was on a call earlier today where someone who was very smart around criminal justice, was like, well, let me tell you. No, actually, let me tell you. And I think it's like, Catalina laughs because this is my life. But my point is that we have to do better around education. We have to do better around talking about this problem more openly, right? And having that hard conversation, because it's also an unconscious bias that people don't want to actually face. I guess that's my point. And I think women in general have to have those hard conversations. I have it a lot with my white friends because I have to. I cannot be in a space of safety if I'm not constantly having this conversation about the fact that, yes, you are my ally, but you still have this unconscious bias. And I love you to pieces, but you still have this unconscious bias. And we have to move that conversation more, and there's a question about Latino communities, and I'm happy to answer that as well.
Yeah, and I want to definitely hear from Melissa too, and we're going to get to the one on the Latino communities because I think this is interesting. But I think there's a romantic notion of women as a voting bloc, right? I do think there is this romantic notion, right? And sometimes, and I think like Melissa, and I appreciated when you brought that up earlier, this idea of.
But we have good news and bad news. Everything that Camille says is true. The good news or bad news is how you see it is the white percentage of the electorate is down to 60%. So Donald Trump takes a look at that and go, how can we keep electing Republicans? Simple. We'll prevent brown people from entering the United States. All of them. We don't care. No more brown people, and that'll keep our majority up. The left looks to the future for solutions. They're willing to try different things, different ideas. Some work, some do not. The right looks to the past for solutions. And so what is Donald Trump besides systemic racism and white supremacy? But there's also a sense of safety. He will talk in language, and his surrogates will talk about safety, law and order and all that. All of us, our heads fall off our heads to see Donald Trump talking about safety. And yet there are parts of the nation where this message resonated, where what they see are fires in our cities and Donald Trump putting black faces and black voices to those fires. And for white people in the suburbs and the exurbs, they go, yes, Donald Trump will keep us safe. And that's one of the things that they vote. So it's conscious, it's subconscious, but they're voting for a safety of a simpler time that exists probably only in their memory or on the television. What's going to happen in 2021, we're going to see more opening up of immigration, and that march towards a much more diverse America will continue as it has since 1980. And by 2030, 2040, the face of our politics will be radically different from what we're seeing now.
Yeah, and I guess I want to add that other piece is the intersectional identities. This is not about, and I think Kira's bringing this up, and things that Camille are bringing up. How do we think about race? How do we think about gender norms? How do we think about class, right? How do we think about immigration status, right? All these pieces that are part of the individual narratives that are really important here show that there's so much diversity even within this kind of women in politics space that we're talking about. I would love to hear, Crystal, you're hearing all this going on around you. What are you thinking? How are you gonna represent all these diverse perspectives from your potential future constituents?
Well, I'm all about unity and not division. I think it's really easy to talk about, pitting people against each other, these people against those people. And, I'm trying to bring everybody together. My district in particular is extremely diverse. And, from socioeconomic statuses to race and ethnicity to age, to, family status. So we have to come together. We have to, but with recognizing that there are, differences and that we're not all the same. But we have to make sure that we're meeting everybody where they are. And so sometimes, the conversation is a little bit different depending on who you're talking to. You're saying the same thing, but you're delivering it in a different way, in a way that is relatable to everybody.
I'd love to go around because I know we don't have as much time as I would love to have to keep this conversation going too. We still have time, but I want to make sure I go around and just ask this one question of the entire panel that's talking tonight. When we're thinking about priority agenda items for women, right? We're talking as women in politics. What comes to mind as a priority right now for you related to the position that you're in? How about we start with you, Camille? You're muted.
Thank you. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this, believe it or not, and I just, because of COVID, and I think one is universal care for all, for all caregivers is something that is so crucial.
Yes.
That we're missing, and that includes childcare, elderly care. And I strongly believe, and I'm not a who is the guy? I'm not a yang gang, but I believe that in some form of universal basic income. Okay. And whether that's from a city, state, or federal level. I think those are the two most important things, because I think from what Melissa stated before, we cannot wait for the government to take care of us and come for us, because they did not. Catalina, it was first, she saw her district just disappear, right? Like, I've lost probably 3 to 5 people from COVID in the last 6 months. My grandmother died alone because we could not have her with us, because we could not afford to have her with us and give her the care that she deserved. Like, that haunts so many of us. And that's a space of empathy that I think our country just doesn't understand. And this is why I want more women in office, because I don't care if you're a Republican, Democrat, or independent. Well, maybe you're a Republican, I don't know. But maybe that's a problem. But most of us, whether we're in the Democratic circle, independent, middle, or left, understand the need to care for people.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And as someone who's immersed in elder care, every time I hear this, wow, we haven't sorted that out. Let's just say that for sure. Catalina, what's pressing right now for you when we think about that?
Look, I think it's difficult to think about and about how to create more equality when I'm barely able to make sure that my community can survive. And so I'm going to agree strongly with Camille on this one. Over the next year, possibly 2, maybe even 3, I have to make sure that the members of my community are really thinking about survival. And I hate that it's this way, because that just means things that would have been a priority that created a more level playing field for the rest of us are now going to have to take a back seat. But that doesn't mean that that the kinds of things that help us survive, that we fail to recognize that those things impact women in women-led households so much more than anything else. The access to healthcare, the access to childcare. I mean, let's take for 30 seconds what happened yesterday. In the middle of the day, the mayor's like, yeah, we're gonna close schools tomorrow. Who do you think had to run to make infinite plans to figure out how they were going to go to work, get the kids to school, feed those kids in less than 24 hours notice? It was women. And so the other part of that is, in communities like mine, where I represent actually the biggest trans Latina community in the entire country, I also have to think about what it means for them not to have access to healthcare, what it means that the majority of them are undocumented or have the kind of status that doesn't let them get any sort of public benefit. And so I think survival for women and folks who identify as women is going to be much tougher over the next 3 years. And so for me, I'm going to prioritize whatever I can do to ensure their survival. And then we can go back to ensuring the success, the individual success of the person.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Crystal, from your positionality, right? What's
it's
top of agenda?
It's funny. I'm grateful that Camille started talking about care, because I was going to say the care economy. Daycares, daycare centers, independent daycares haven't received the relief that they've needed throughout the pandemic. I always think about the full lifespan and care across our lives from birth to death. Child care, elder care, all the things that have been mentioned. All issues are women's issues, and all issues are LGBTQ issues, as far as I'm concerned. So I'd have to just add to the care economy piece.
When you take a look in New York State,
and Melissa, let's go to you. Go for it. What's pressing for you? Talk about that.
When you have in New York State, when you have the Office of Aging, NYSOFA, and you take a look there, it's 0.5% of the budget, and the desperate need to raise that from 0.5% to 2/3 and how much work and effort and energy. And all of us are getting older, our communities are getting older, the services are diminishing. When you take a look at advocates for aging, it's all women, virtually 100% women, that come together, because we know that as our parents are going to age, who's going to be left in charge to make sure that if we're taking care of our young, we're taking care of our elders. And so women are very, very in touch with how much work it is, as Catalina pointed out, in closing schools, in order to keep our culture moving and making sure there's enough care and people provided for. Women are in charge of that. When you take a look at the priorities at the state budget and the federal budget, we need more women with financial decision making to make sure that our families and that our people are safe in our cities and our country.
Absolutely. And Kira, from your perspective.
Yeah, I guess just building on what's been said, and especially what Camille was saying, I think that, I think about women in politics all the time, but I think in the COVID era, I think we're seeing so many different failures of policy at different levels, and you do wonder if more women were in leadership roles, what would the response to COVID have been like? And I don't mean that in an essentialist way. I mean, if women who weren't worried about seeming tougher than the disease, like our president, he's too masculine to need to wear a mask, and these leadership style questions. And of course, with the economic situation, we're seeing women disproportionately affected in terms of their labor force participation. And we've talked about the caregiving roles and the strains on women across the country and here in New York. And so I think that unfortunately, this may hinder women's political voice, because we already talked about the relationship between money and politics and women being paid less. And so I think I'm very concerned about, even though we're at a moment in our history where we are seeing a lot of women running for office, what does the future hold when these short, medium, long-term effects of COVID and the economy play out? So I think it's concerning, and I think that the solution is more voice from women and more women running and supporting each other in the ways we've already talked about.
Thank you. I'm going to end the last question with a quote, because whenever I can, when think of art or something that inspires me. So I'm gonna read a quote from Audre Lorde. All right, I'm going to channel her right now and just hear from whoever wants to respond. How does it relate to them and understanding their journey as women in politics? It says, "When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid." Audre Lorde. Any thoughts on that?
I'll start. In 2018, I watched Catalina Cruz run for state assembly. She had a lot of forces against her. She was fierce and funny and smart, and the two of us, we noticed each other doing this, and each were so inspired. And Catalina won her race, and I did not. But you know something? If we're going to be as empowered as Audre Lorde talked about, then we get to define what is a success and what is a failure. I got to tell you, I woke up the day after that primary, I felt bad. So I did the only thing I could possibly do. I got a cat. But I get to decide what is a failure and what is success. And in spite of my personal feelings about this, when I walked out of my apartment, the world had changed because I was willing to stand up for something and take on a challenge that most people thought was out of the question. And so it maybe didn't work for me, but now there's going to be a cohort of trans women, not only here, but elsewhere, that go, if Melissa did it, then I can do it too. And so maybe I'm not the best one to define what is failure, what is success, and I'll let the next generation do that.
There's a whole bunch of quotes on this, and I guess I'd say, I feel every day. and that's okay. It just makes me stronger and more powerful. I've had what I would call failures in career versus loss. I would say that my failures built up my power every single time. And, I take loss very much cathartically. Like, I think about it. I said this the other day. It's like, I lost, I came home, I banged the wall, I took a drink, and then I went to bed. Right. I was like, when I win, I have 2 drinks, I just think we have to look at loss as a way to challenge ourselves, to build strength within it. And if how many men lose races and they get right back up and they're like, oh, I'm going to run again. Wow. You just got kicked in the face twice. Women are like, I don't know if I could do this again. Right. So I just think we have to take on those moments, mourn, and then put on our, big girl undies on, or boxers, whatever the hell we want to wear, and just keep on going.
All right. Well, I have another one for the last couple of folks. Another quote. "If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive." Crystal, can you respond to that? What does that make you think?
Yeah, that definitely resonates with me. Right. As somebody who is, gender nonconforming, masculine of center, I don't fit the norms or the boxes for what a woman looks like. But I'm here, and I am a woman, and I am no less of a woman because of the type of woman or the way that I identify, or how I present, than any other woman. And so I think, that quote definitely resonates with me, because if I allowed everybody else to define who I am, then I quite literally wouldn't be me. And so I think it's so powerful and empowering when we can stand in our truths and, you know, be who we are, be our full selves, unapologetically.
Thank you for that. Catalina?
No, I had a very interesting process with defining who I was. I actually had to accept who I was. For a very long time, I hid the fact that I was undocumented. And when I decided to run, I was actually very afraid that it would come out and people would hear about it from somebody else and my mom and what happens to my family. And it literally felt like if I didn't define what my own story was, and ultimately, you know, yes, it is a story of success, but when you have grown up your entire life, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, when you have grown up your entire life afraid, oh, not afraid, but knowing that there are consequences to telling the truth about who you are. And for me, it was possible deportation and separation from my own family. It was terrifying, but much more so to not live my own truth. And it's the one thing I always tell anyone who wants to run for office. You have to be genuinely you. Because if you end up, I don't want to say failing, not being successful that time, there's always another time and some other feat that you can attempt where you find your own version of success. You run, as Amanda taught me, you run with grace so you could lose with dignity, if that's what ends up happening. But you get to define who you want to be as a candidate. You get to define who you want to be as a consultant. You get to define who you want to be as a person. Because ultimately, every day when you wake up fighting for your community, you have to look at yourself in the mirror and know that the person I portray to be for my neighbors, for my community, is that really who I am? Because otherwise, I can tell you, it is exhausting. I have seen colleagues and I have seen people who created personas just so that they could run and win, and I have no clue where their footing is at.
Wow, and then Kira.
Yeah, I guess I would say one of the things that I'm thinking about right now is that women have much more to say and much more power than they often think they have. And I think it's because people have defined women and our culture and historically have defined us in a way that makes us feel that we have less power. But I think going back to women voters, women are a majority of voters. And I think there's incredible power there in women's political participation and the care that they have for their communities that we see every day. And so I think it just has to be something people take up and don't let other people define them. And I guess I would say that in particular at this moment, there's so much work to do that there are just a lot of opportunities. I think women, for all the reasons that we've been talking about on this panel, what all these women, my co-panelists, bring to politics, there's so many experiences and there's so many communities that are tapped here. That's a source of incredible coalition and a lot of political possibilities. So I think that if you don't let others define you, it actually turns out that you can really make a big difference.
I know we are at time and I want to be respectful of that. So I want to say first, thank you to this incredible panel. Talk about being inspiring and also for reminding us of our power, but also our responsibility in lifting and raising others. Thank you. Now I'll turn it over to Cynthia.
Oh, you're on mute, Cynthia.
You're on mute, Cynthia.
Thank you. What a marvelous, incredible, robust, rich panel this has been. Women's panel. Lisette, we will have you as a moderator anytime. Your depth and understanding and intellect. Wow, thank you. Thank you. Kira, a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for giving us some national perspective, including less than maybe appropriate amount, not appropriate amounts, less women elected at local level. I thought that was very interesting. We're just starting a whole focus at New Pride Agenda regarding local matters, localities, your community, your towns, and then beyond that, your districts, your cities, your state. And that's how I grew up organizing in Chicago, local matters. And you build from there and influence the national agenda. So I really appreciate your saying that. Crystal, thank you for reminding us Black women are the first to fix and maybe last on the list. I hear you, and I hear that again, and take it in. Melissa, you're a rock star. I don't know, I just, I could take 2 pages of just your quotes. But basically, when we started the New Pride Agenda and we wanted to focus more on transgender, non-conforming, non-binary, different communities, people of color. And, I kind of looked to my right and looked to my left. It's like, come on, you see this is a need. We got to start this. And it's like, where is the cavalry? And then we came with a bunch of friends saying, we are the cavalry. We are the cavalry. And so we will continue this fight. Catalina, I loved your quote about completely being outraised, but not outworked. I hear you, lady. I'm exhausted. I hear you. But that is an asset that I think women take on differently and approach very differently. The schools example, stunning. 24 hours, I just, C3. This lovely lady I never met before.
There's a race for mayor coming around, just saying.
I know. And this lovely lady, Camille, thank you for reminding me always about the importance of race and privilege. And I continue to learn from you and others like you. And I thank you for that, Camille. So thank you, lovely ladies. We're trying to survive. If any of you or anyone watching tomorrow or another day would like to be supportive of the New Pride Agenda, please just look at our website, www.newprideagenda.org. It's not fancy. It's just a few of us trying to make this happen. And if you can make a contribution to help with our match, we are working for you, honestly.
And just on that, Cynthia, we will do our absolute best. I'm going to go back to the 21 and 21 board. Obviously, we want you to succeed, and we will be there for you, and I will be there for you, and we should talk offline. I want to be as helpful as possible to support your voice, and maybe we can do some matching or something. I'm just an honor to be here. Thank you.
No, thank you. And me, I told that to Amelia, me for 21 and 21. As soon as we get a nice young bright mind here and I go on the board, I will be happy to help you. Really, 21 and 21. You women are fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And join us in a couple weeks when we hear about the federal perspective, and just keep those cards and letters coming. Keep teaching, keep pushing, and we will really work as best as we can. Thank you so.
Awesome.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank
Wonderful meeting everyone.
Wear your mask, everyone.
Thank you. Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.